is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. On The Agenda this week, I'll be talking to the man who's trying to solve the world's refugee crisis. Filippo Grandi is head of the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR.
The failure of Europe, there's been several areas of failure, I think, but if there's one that stands out, in my opinion, is the failure to work together, not even as a continent, but as a union that already exists. That's been a failure.
And I'll also be talking to the head of the UK's Refugee Council and asking him, how did the EU get it so badly wrong, and how many people has the UK allowed in? The world is on the move in numbers never seen before. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, there are almost 71 million people, half of them children, who have been forcibly displaced. And it really is a global problem. From Afghanistan, 2.5 million people trying to escape war and extremism have headed west. 6.5 million Syrians have fled the country. Many not getting any further away than massive refugee camps in Turkey. And some have made the dangerous sea crossings across the Aegean to Greece. Some, of course, never made it. They drowned in flimsy boats. The others have been forced to stay in dirty and overcrowded camps. In sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Sahel region, millions are heading north towards Europe. So many millions on the move, some within their own countries, but the UN admits several hundred million more may well be a more accurate figure, swollen by economic migrants, all looking for better lives. And many of them are being exploited by ruthless people traffickers. Now, his job has been described as a Herculean task, but Filippo Grandi, who's been in his job for nearly 4 years, is a man on a mission, a humanitarian with a touch of the diplomat. He's determined to make a difference. At his office headquarters in Geneva, I began by asking him to define the difference between a refugee and a migrant.
Refugees are people fleeing from war, violence, persecution, people that cannot be sent back to their countries because they risk their lives, essentially. Migrants are people that move for sometimes very compelling reasons. Poverty, climate change these days is also having an impact. Sometimes the two overlap, of course, but it's different causes and different situations. So I think that there is an obligation to support migrants too, but there is a different constraint in terms of going back to their homes or not. This is a fundamental issue. That's why we always, we use a very technical term, refoulement, which means sending back. It's a French term that means pushing back. And non-refoulement, non-pushing back, is one of the key international refugee protection principles.
Turkey, which has hosted 3.5 million Syrian refugees, now President Erdogan seems to have lost patience and is ejecting many Syrian refugees from Turkish cities. Do you have a role in trying to persuade Turkey to hold on to their refugees? Because otherwise there could be another humanitarian catastrophe in the making.
This is not entirely accurate. What has happened is that Turkey has started enforcing a rule that was there from the beginning of this influx of Syrian refugees, whereby you have to reside in the province where you are registered to be a refugee. And above all, you have to be registered to be supported, to have access to services, to jobs, and so forth. So in a way, Turkey is putting some order in a situation that has been allowed to grow a little bit organically, a little bit spontaneously, out of generosity, out of giving people a maximum of opportunities. Now, in this putting some order to it, certainly some people will have to move away from big cities like Istanbul, where they have a lot of opportunities to smaller places where it will be a bit more challenging for them and where they will need more assistance. But one thing is certain, and I think this is perhaps the most important, I have not heard anybody among my interlocutors in Turkey saying, for example, that refugees have to go back to their country because they've overstayed their time in Turkey. So Turkey is still hosting 3.6 million Syrians. In fact, Turkey is hosting refugees from other countries as well, more than 4 million altogether.
You're being very diplomatic about Turkey.
No, I'm being realistic. This is exactly the situation as it is.
Some city mayors, some town mayors are saying families are being told they have to leave and they're being funneled and channeled towards Syria.
Well, there has been a few cases, and we know more or less, we are aware more or less of most of them because they've been brought to our attention, where people were not only sent back to other municipalities where they were supposed to be registered, but actually in an excess of zeal, I would say, were also asked to go back to Syria. And the cases are not many. I mean, in these huge numbers that we're talking about, they are more in the dozens than in the thousands. So this has been raised with the Turkish authorities, and the Turkish authorities have explicitly told me that it is not a policy. If this has happened, it was wrong and it should not happen again. So we're looking at how to address that.
So according to UNHCR, Turkey is not expelling refugees.
There is certainly not a policy of expulsion. That is absolutely clear to me. There may have been cases where this has happened, and as always in Turkey, you know, this is something that we've done over the years. We're raising it with the authorities. I mean, the dialogue with the authorities on these matters is open. Now, you must understand, I'm not trying to justify anybody. Expulsions to a country where people don't want to go back to is wrong, is dangerous for these people, so it shouldn't happen. But when you're talking about these huge figures, it may happen, and then measures have to be taken for this to be prevented.
You've talked often about humanitarian aid and talked about it being de-linked from politics. Isn't that impossible? Isn't that sort of a theory or something you'd like? But in reality, it just will never happen, not least because politicians always are the ones who approve spending.
Well, surely we are not naive. We know that although we are humanitarians, not only us, but many other organizations, we operate in a very politicized world. Not only that, the type of humanitarian crisis my organization deals with, refugee crisis, are by definition the result of political crisis, be they conflict or bad governance or violence, civil war, and so forth. So, of course, there is a continuous link between the political sphere and the humanitarian sphere. But I think you say it's a theory. I don't know. I think that for people who are in danger, at risk, who are hungry or thirsty or ill, it's not a theory. To receive adequate support is a very dire real need. But I want to add one important element, and we've been saying this for, 25 years? You must have heard it many times, even from my predecessors. Much as humanitarian aid should not be politicized, the solutions to humanitarian problems are political. There's no humanitarian solution to a humanitarian problem. So that's I would say, a positive link with politics that we are actually encouraging and that we're not always successful in achieving.
You talked about conflict. Does UNHCR have a role in peace and security and in trying to solve conflicts, or are you above all that?
Well, what's above peace? Nothing. So nobody's above peace. I think peace should be the horizon and the ceiling. But within that horizon and the ceiling, we have several roles, I would say. First of all, refugee flows are not only a symptom of conflict, or a consequence of conflict, they can also be quite destabilizing. We estimate that 85 to 90% stay actually in the country next to theirs. And many of those countries have very little resources. Many of those countries are also very fragile. So their presence can destabilize, and supporting them, ensuring that they are stable in that particular country is also a contribution to regional stability. And then, of course, we are not an actor working towards peace agreements. That's not our job. But in that context of peace discussions, the return of refugees, solutions to refugee problems must always be taken into account. In other words, we've seen many conflicts in which that element was neglected. Displacement continued to exist after peace agreements were signed, and that became an impediment to the implementation of peace.
70 million refugees on the road, considering the world population, it's not very many. What, 1%, would you say? Why are they on the road, in your experience? And you're a mixture of a humanitarian, a politician, a diplomat. You have to wear a number of hats. Which one's your favorite hat, by the way?
The humanitarian one.
Humanitarian one. With a little bit of politician and diplomat thrown in perhaps as well.
Just awareness of those dimensions, yeah.
So 1%, does that mean the world is more peaceful?
Everything is relative. It depends on how you look at that figure.
Or fewer wars.
70 million people is the size of a big country. It's a lot of people. These are people that have no more the protection of their own country. So they need international protection. It's quite a big number, I would say. And it's a number that unfortunately has been rising. Of course, if you look at it against the 7 billion, you're right, it's a small number. But it is a complicated group of people that needs special attention. Plus another issue that is very real nowadays. People, refugees, do not move alone. Very often they move alongside other people that are seeking economic opportunities or otherwise. So we call these, with a technical name, mixed flows. These mixed flows are becoming very complicated to address because people have different needs and different rights also and different requirements. Everybody should be treated with dignity, but the way you treat people seeking jobs and the way you way you treat refugees presents some distinctions naturally, and therefore it has to be addressed. So in reality, the number of people on the move is much bigger, is in the hundreds of millions, part of whom are refugees. So we also need to look at it not only as a isolated problem, but as a phenomenon which is inscribed in this bigger phenomenon of human mobility, which today is one of the big global challenges.
Do you believe in borders? Because Mr. Guterres doesn't and the European Union doesn't.
Well, I can't speak for others, including for the Secretary General, but whether I believe in borders or not is immaterial, in fact, because borders exist and are enforced in most of the cases.
Rightly or wrongly?
There are attempts at overcoming borders, like the European Union is one of them. There are attempts at strengthening borders, or building walls. I would certainly be against that. I think that since borders exist, states exist, nation states exist, I think that what we need to make sure is that those borders are well managed, and in that good management, the principles, for example, applying to refugees, i.e. that they should be allowed to cross border if they're fleeing for their life, that those principles are respected as part of the good management of borders.
What about the refugees arriving in Greece at the moment? Last month, 7,000, most of them from Syria and Afghanistan, arrived in the Greek islands. 600 in one day. Greece can't cope. The people running the camps in Greece can't cope. The European Union can't cope. Why has there been such a failure over the refugees coming across the Mediterranean? Well, what's your explanation?
For a variety of reasons. You know, people are always asking me to provide a simple answer to this very complicated question. There is no simple answer. Sorry, I apologize for that. So I have to give you 2 or 3 points. One is that, and that's the most important, there is insufficient action to address the causes why these people are moving. And that is a very wide range of issues. There is insufficient peacemaking in the world. That's why wars continue forever or are never really resolved, like we see in some parts of Africa, for example. Then there is very unstrategic use of development assistance to address inequality, poverty, the consequences of climate change. Let's hope that all this debate on climate, for example, will help channel more strategically resources in that area. Because these are important things. Because if you can address those root causes, you will automatically diminish the number of people moving on. Then, still, people will continue to move on, and also addressing the causes will take time. And in that, I think that the failure of Europe, there's been several areas of failure, I think. But if there's one that stands out, in my opinion, is the failure to work together, not even as a continent, but as a union that already exists. That's been a failure. Even when things became so bad that Europe had to resort to this famous reallocation of people from Greece and Italy to other countries, that was a pretty straightforward program. It concerned 160,000 people, very manageable in a continent of 500 million people. That did not succeed. A small percentage of those people were moved from one country to the other. And that came out of the inability of Europe to work together, but even more importantly, on the fact that we allowed so much space for the political manipulation of these flows, that everybody, even moderate governments, became very hesitant to take action and receive those refugees.
And now you have Italy sort of saying, okay, we are not going to allow the rescue of refugees, migrants on boats in the Mediterranean.
Well, I think that the target there has been rescue by NGOs, by private vessels, and our point has always been that given that it is, there's a lot of people crossing, there's very dangerous journeys, all available capacity should be used. And that means state capacity. This is also something the EU has decreased. That means NGO, civil society capacity, which has been sometimes politically targeted. And that means private capacity, merchant vessels. Of course, if you have a campaign saying that rescue is bad and should be penalized, you don't encourage people to rescue. That's a vicious circle that needs to be reversed. Now, there's a new government in Italy. There is a debate on positive attitude towards rescue at sea. Yeah. I hope that that will be a positive signal and that other European countries also will restore that capacity.
That is a big problem for UNHCR, isn't it? These cultural divides between the Middle East and Europe, in terms of acceptance.
I think it's a big problem for some people, for sure. I also know that if you analyze the situation of the hundreds of thousands of Syrians, for example, that were accepted in Germany from 2015 onward, about half have found employment. So actually the story is much more positive than it is portrayed. This goes back to the point I made a few minutes ago, that there is political manipulation that emphasizes the negative, presents these people as a threat to jobs, to security, to values, the usual litany of issues that we hear. There's also a very big part of public opinion that doesn't buy this story, that understands, one, that there is an obligation in the case of refugees,
well,
and
voters
two,
do.
that
voters
there is
do because they're voting for the extreme parties.
Yes, and I think, democracy is democracy, and I think we have to operate in that environment, and I think our role as an international organization is to put forward a more positive story, not just for the sake of it, not just making it up, but through concrete examples of how these people contribute to societies, how they are not in reality a threat, they flee from a threat. Most of them are people that want to rebuild their lives in these societies.
Filippo Grandi, and I'll return to my conversation with Mr. Grandi in a moment. But first, let's get the view from here in the United Kingdom. Maurice Wren is Chief Executive of the UK Refugee Council and the man responsible for influencing how the UK copes with those people who are seeking asylum. And Mr. Wren joins me in the Agenda studio now. Maurice, we've heard from UNHCR about the European reaction to the migrant crisis and heard some criticism about the way Europe has handled that crisis. Is that fair criticism?
Yes, I think so, and I'd actually challenge the terminology. I don't think there was a migrant or, more specifically, a refugee crisis. I think there was, we would call it a crisis of European political institutions to manage a situation that was inevitable, but certainly could have been predicted, given the nature of the conflicts erupting in Syria and North Africa and the Middle East, that eventually at some point we were going to get substantial refugee flows. But the failure of Europe to operate as was intended back in 1999 with the development of the common European asylum system, the failure of that to really take root and influence national policy, I think, is an indictment of European political institutions. At the heart of common European asylum system was the concept of shared responsibility, and we've seen little of that over the years. But I think what worries us is the emergence of what we'd call a two-tier protection system, where those who are brought into the UK in agreement with the UNHCR under what we call resettlement programmes get 5-star support, integration support locally. Those who don't, and we're talking about 4 out of 5 people who are given protection in the UK, not who seek protection, but who are given protection, undergo quite a robust determination process to check their eligibility. Those 4 out of 5, I think we systematically let down, and we could do much better for them.
And that was Maurice Wren, head of the UK Refugee Council. But back now to my exclusive interview with the UN's Filippo Grandi and how he and his colleagues are dealing with those millions on the move. What is your role as UNHCR in somewhere like Libya, where the jumping off point for many migrants and refugees coming across the Mediterranean, and the camps there, where conditions are reported to be awful, run by traffickers, some of them funded by the European Union? It's a catastrophic situation, according to our correspondents anyway, in those Libyan camps. Women are raped, men are raped, there's no control. When the migrants are sent off, they pay for their journeys. The people traffickers are running it. ISIS are making money from it. It's right on Europe's doorstep. How can the UNHCR help with a situation like that?
First of all, there's no camp in Libya. Let's be very clear, because there's so much confusion around this, and there's no funding of any camps by anybody, except by the traffickers, perhaps. What there is detention centers where, unfortunately, many migrants are placed by Libya, or sometimes these detention camps are not even run by the government of Libya, they're run by militias. Unfortunately, what has also happened is that Europe, because of its preoccupation to decrease the number of people crossing, has helped Libya reinforce its Coast Guard. In itself, this is not bad, it is a legitimate issue, but if you only reinforce the Coast Guard whilst the rest of the country is at war and has no institution able to manage this group of people, it's very dangerous, because in fact what we know is that many of the people rescued, so to speak, by the Coast Guard are disembarked and put back into jail.
Correct. And then they have to pay again for another journey.
Or, even worse, live under abuse. So what we have done there is we have campaigned very, very actively together with other organizations.
Do you have a presence in the detention?
We have a presence in Libya, difficult, people risking their lives because this is a country at war, but we have a presence. We try to have access to migrants and refugees. We work with agencies working with the migration flow. These are not all refugees, but they're all in a very dire situation, so we must help them. We work with IOM and others. We try to have access. We try to help them where we can. We have also campaigned for detention to end and for people to be allowed to live in communities with suitable support. We understand the country cannot do it by itself. So this is where few successes we've had, very few. Some of the disembarked people now are not put back into detention center, although many still are, so the problem is not resolved. Then we have convinced everybody to have a program of evacuation of people in order to resettle refugees, as we call it.
Return them home?
No, not return them home. Resettle to third countries. You need to screen them. You need to make sure that these are genuine refugees, that they do not carry other risks and so forth. So that cannot be done in Libya very efficiently because of the situation. So Niger has offered a platform, a place for transit, and 2 days ago Rwanda did the same.
Yes.
This is quite remarkable that African countries are, for the first time, somehow participating in an international effort to help people from their continent.
Just go back to the Syrian refugees. Have many returned voluntarily?
Not
with
many.
your help?
Not many. We do not promote the return of Syrian refugees. The country is still complex from that point of view, but we are well aware of some thousands of people that have returned from neighboring countries, from Turkey, for example, from Lebanon, from Jordan in particular. And
do you support that?
We support the people who go back. If people go back, I've been to their places of return. I visited them. There was no doubt in my mind that the people that I visited had come back spontaneously. In addition, remember, these numbers are relatively small. Now, those people are left on their own, and they deserve some humanitarian assistance. The question of reconstruction in Syria is very complex. Is linked to a still unresolved conflict. It has political dimensions. I don't want to go down that avenue. It's not my job, but my appeal to all donors is for those who go back spontaneously, at least humanitarian assistance, because otherwise we are missing out on an obligation.
What's your advice to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Turkey, who have this massive burden of refugees and say, oh, we've done our bit, UNHCR, you take over, Commissioner, you're in charge now. What are you telling them?
We can certainly not say that until those countries host refugees, especially in those enormous numbers that you know. We have to be there, and we will be there with them. But I think that what 2015 showed is that the humanitarian assistance that we can mobilize is not quite enough. And this is why, especially in places like Jordan, that a very cooperative country, we've experimented new approaches with the World Bank, with the private sector, with bilateral donors, looking at, how can I define them, post-humanitarian issues. Education, secondary education for refugees, for host communities, employment for both, developing the economy of areas impacted by the arrival of refugees, addressing issues of scarcity of resources like water. These are the things that we need to tell those countries. We have to tell them, and believe me, it's painful when you see the burden they're bearing.
Lastly, do you ever feel you've got 70 million forcibly displaced people on your hands? Do you ever feel you're swimming against the tide?
Sometimes, of course, I do. Very often I do. But the important thing is that we keep swimming.
Commissioner, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Brussels' big idea was a borderless Europe. The resulting Schengen Agreement allowed free travel across 26 countries. But reality is now trumping that naivety, and the walls are starting to go up again. So far, 6 European countries have reimposed random border checks to try and turn off the flow. According to Eurodac, that's an organisation established to identify irregular border crossers, 250,000 illegal secondary migrants have already been caught. But many more are getting through, and the European Council admits there is no Euro-wide clear picture on the scale of secondary migration. And what that translates to is that the European Union has no idea about the numbers of illegal migrants coming into Western Europe. Yes, I've come here to talk to politicians of all hues and loyalties to find out what the likely impact will be of Brexit on the world's financial powerhouse, the City of London. It's been a political discussion like no other. The rows, the negotiations, the rancour has already cost 2 prime ministers their jobs. On the one hand, the bloc of nations that make up the European Union. On the other, the UK, seemingly friendless and alone. But who has the most to lose? The UK leaving the safety of the world's largest trading bloc, or the EU opening the floodgates for other members to withdraw? Join me, Stephen Cole, on The Agenda to find out. And that's next week on The Agenda, with me, Stephen Cole. But for now, from the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.